In natural history, we see tipping points in which creatures must adapt to survive. We're familiar, of course, with the survival of certain genetic adaptations in the animal kingdom. The environment changes and the fittest survive. But the situation for mankind is a bit more complicated. Humans are uniquely unique. Pioneers can move to a new environment and, because of our ability for abstract thought, they can create new ideas about how to survive in that place, creating crucial tools, for instance. It seems only 1 in 5 have this ability, if that, but these innovators can then also create a whole culture so that a whole group of followers can then adapt to that new environment. Increasingly, they will adapt genetically, of course, to that environment, and so humanity's unique ability for creativity and adaptation continues. These two things are really largely two sides of the same coin. For humanity, the development of their genes and the development of their ideas go hand in hand. They're a part of our process of adaptation. Within a settled society, there will likewise be tipping points at which these innovators can discover developments to their own culture. This especially takes place when certain customs or traditions are no longer fit for purpose. We can really view this as a cycle of genes and memes or ideas. However, understanding which parts of our culture are actually adaptive and should be kept as tradition, and when to innovate better practices or technologies is a very important task. Having a system of doing so ensures that there is no disagreement between traditionalism and futurism. As I say, these are both two sides of the same coin. In this video, we will answer the questions: what are memes, or ideas, and what makes a good meme? We'll also discover what happens when innovation goes too far, becoming a threat to stable civilization, or even to our own survival.
Rome is civilization! Rome is order! Rome is power! And out here, we are Rome!
So welcome to this edition. I wanted to make this video because very often I'll find myself talking with some people who are traditionalists to the point that they don't really like science and technology. And I, of course, find myself as well speaking to people who are very much futurists, and they are very individualistic, even though they consider themselves a part of the right wing. Now, I think properly understood, there's absolutely no dichotomy. There's no disagreement between these two, between traditionalism and futurism. And I hope to show that with this video. I hope to convince you, as well as all those others. I promise by the end of this you'll think, well, actually that was really simple. How did I not see that before? That's my aim anyway. Feel free to leave comments afterwards, but yeah, let's crack on. Genes and memes are sort of yin and yang. There's a cycle to them, of course. Asking which is most important for human adaptation is a sort of chicken and egg question, really. We develop new ideas. These help us to adapt to our environment. And as we adapt more to that environment and as we grow and flourish, we're able to then innovate and we create more ideas, and so we're able to then flourish elsewhere, or perhaps even better in the environment that we find ourselves. And indeed, I mean, it's all information. This is all just information, and you might be thinking, well, humans communicate these ideas with each other, and that is quite true. Um, but animals as well, they are, in a sense, if we consider Wiener's cybernetic feedback loop idea, basically animals are also communicating with the environment. They're sending up messages. The environment is sending them messages about what's going on. The animal senses, they're able to pick up on this, um, and they are able to then send out their own messages into the environment, looking for light, food, water sources, that sort of thing. And of course, as we know, animals have some forms of communication with each other. In a sense, they are actually passing on ideas to each other. It's just that the way that humans do this um, is at a much more advanced level, and our thinking is much more abstract. So the communication that we're capable of is much more complex. What are memes? Well, as you can see on the screen, Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, which is actually a really good book. I'm actually very fond of Richard Dawkins, as you can imagine, with him being a new atheist and me being a Catholic. I'm thinking he's just so wrong on so many philosophical and theological points. That's really easy uh, to debunk that, really. But The Selfish Gene is actually a very interesting book. I think it's fairly well written, and there's a reason it gets 5 out of 5 stars everywhere. Very interesting stuff. But in that book, Richard Dawkins poses the concept of a meme, like a gene, but for him, this is where ideas get propagated out. They in turn spread the memes from person to person, mind to mind. So for him, a meme, which he takes from an ancient Greek word, it just means idea, but it's like a unit of cultural transmission, if you think about it that way. Of course, we're all more familiar with memes on the internet, being those little pictures that speak 1,000 words, and have a lot of impact because they're very truthful, very poignant. They make us think. And yeah, I mean, they are a kind of meme. All right, don't get too bamboozled by the two graphs above me. I'm not going to go on too much about this, but this is basically just to show that, and this is some work by Csikszentmihalyi, and he basically showed that you know there's a process to the way that genes work with the environment, and you can see there's a cycle there, and it's interesting because he then concluded, Dawkins is right. Memes also follow a similar pattern, really. Um, he calls this process creativity, which is great. I tend to agree with this, basically. The memes, they're units of cultural transmission. They contain information. They're instructions of how to behave. Yes, I mean, it's to do with creativity, but this is basically also how cultures evolve. You see the word culture at the top there. And I think it's very important to understand that basically this process of creativity and passing on memes, innovating new memes, this is what drives cultural evolution. So the way I like to think of it is basically memes are just like the genetic makeup of our culture. If you see my other videos on corporatism, the scientific data just say that when humans form groups, those groups behave like they're an independent organism. I think that the culture that binds those groups together, and the memes that make it up, it's a good idea to maybe think of memes as being like the genetics, the genes of the culture of this corporate body politic, if you like. So memes are the DNA of the body politic, if you think about it like that, perhaps. Okay, so that's great, genes and memes. How does any of that relate to traditionalism and futurism? Um, in a nutshell, futurism wants to focus on developing new ideas. Traditionalism wants to preserve the good ideas that were already created in the past and have stood the test of time, and we should probably keep those because they're useful, they're adaptive. You know, this is like where memes are new ideas, and you know they enable us to do something new and adapt. And the genes more come about when a culture has then been created with those ideas, and a whole society has adapted to that, and so it's kind of cemented, if you like. It's not so liquid and fluid and as memes, developing new ideas, and this is how things should be or could be. But nevertheless, okay, they're still part of the same process, right? The genes and the memes. This is basically what's going on with traditionalism versus futurism. But what do those terms even mean? Traditionalism, futurism. Some people might be more familiar with the term traditionalism. They might not exactly know what it is. Futurism, I find that people actually don't totally know what that is. They probably think that it's people who are into transhumanism. So, downloading your brain into a computer eventually and stuff like that. So the Futurists were a movement in Italy in the early 1900s. And there's a nice little extract here from Wikipedia that I thought summed it up quite nicely. It says, Futurists admired speed, technology, youth and violence, the car, the airplane, industrial cities, the technological triumph of humanity over nature. And, interestingly, they were passionate nationalists. So it's this strange combination that was going on, because on the one hand, they did have a strong respect for the group and the nation, but also they really emphasized the more individualistic and innovative parts of the society. Because, it's important to understand there's innovation within the group and for the good of the group, and there's a kind of innovation where you want to break away from the group and you want to be separate from it. You're totally individualistic. And then, okay, so, what's tradition? I like this quote. I might not necessarily agree with everything about the person who said it, but it is a great quote. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. So something traditionalists have to understand is that at one point their tradition was a new idea. It was an innovation. And over time, through organic processes, yes, it became tradition. It was understood, okay, this has stood the test of time. We're going to keep this. This is good. Fire, the new technology brought to us by Prometheus, like at one time was a new thing. So don't worship the ashes, don't worship the ruins. You have to take the good and the essence and what has stood the test of time and preserve it. Again, this is something that futurists don't necessarily understand. They want to kind of pigeonhole trads as being these people who just worship the ruins and want to go back. They want to go back rather than move forward. So there's actually a lot of common ground. It's just there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding of the two. But I want to show that futurism and tradition, they're both a part of the same process. Whether it's generating new ideas through our memes and those becoming cemented as a culture with its own genetic makeup and everything, they're the same thing. Now, the reason there's so much disagreement is because, yes, okay, you do get lots of traditionalists who are worshipping the ashes. They look at the ruins and, they say, oh, weren't things so much better in the past? And they want to go back. Okay, likewise, with futurists, they can become these progressives who just want to do away with everything in the past and completely innovate something new. Well, all right, but then you end up losing something that might be really, really important. Now, G.K. Chesterton, brilliant writer and theologian and all the rest of it, he noted this very well. He said the problem that we have is we've got conservatives and progressives, and they're doing it all wrong. They're doing it all wrong. They don't really get what's good about traditionalism. They don't really get what's good about futurism. So, if you look in the middle of the screen, there's a nice little bit where he says the advanced person rushes us into ruin. He forgets all that's good from the past, all the important lessons from the past, important bits of culture from the past that protect us in ways that we can't even think of. Whereas the retrospective person, the typical traditionalist caricature, he's admiring the ruins and he wants to go back. And G.K. Chesterton, rather humorously, he says this is called the balance or mutual check in our constitution, where these two sides are fighting it out, but it's not how things should be. You see, G.K. Chesterton had his idea of the white fence. G.K. Chesterton's fence is basically this idea that if you bought a piece of land, and it's totally new to you, you don't know what's going on in this place, and then there's a fence and there's a gate on that piece of land. If you were going to just say, oh, well, we'll get rid of that, before you even know what purpose it serves, that's not a smart move. So reforming, innovation, all of that. G.K. Chesterton, although he's known as a traditionalist, was all for that. He wanted constant reform. He wanted to constantly be painting this fence white, renew the fence. He wanted to preserve the fire, basically, and not worship the ashes. So he says his principle basically was find out exactly what this fence is for and this gate. Once you understand that fully, okay, then maybe you can talk about removing the fence and the gate. And it's like that with parts of our culture as well, especially adaptive parts of our culture. And this is something that the scholarship on memes doesn't really seem to understand. A lot of the scholarship, it's written by people who are progressives, and so they're this advanced perspective, the people who want to rush us into ruin that Chesterton was talking about. You have a character like Lindenfors. He said there are two tests to determine if a meme is adaptive and therefore can survive and eventually become tradition. The test of time and the test of reality. Now they say that, scholars will say that, but then they completely gloss over the test of time and they totally focus on this test of reality, which is basically just the scientific method. So all they're doing is just giving us, modern enlightenment, empiricism, scientific method. And what does this do? I mean, it just proposes constant innovation. Let's innovate something totally new and get rid of the traditional forms and cultures that were there before. Okay, now you might point to the example of traditional medicine. Not all of traditional medicine makes sense, or maybe you've got some tree bark, but actually it's just like the aspirin and the willow bark or whatever that you're trying to get, and so instead of just boiling bark, maybe synthesize or extract just the aspirin and use that instead. And so people say, well, look at modern medicine. Hasn't modern medicine been great? And many aspects of it have been. I would not be here if it were not for modern medicine, for a variety of reasons, actually. But are all innovations and removals of traditional practices helpful to us? Was the innovation of plastic a universal good? and the consequent abandonment of traditional materials? Has mass urbanization and the removal of beautiful architecture been a universal good? Has mass immigration and the removal of an ethno-nationalistic idea of a people been a universal good? Now, of course, we could go on about the countless removals of organic and traditional systems of order in society and the implementation of completely artificial ones by the state, the process of modernity, basically. And we could question whether all of those things have been universally good for Western countries and the rest of the world. But basically, the conclusion we come to is just focusing on this test of reality, whether here and now, in this moment, I can perform an experiment and I can discover, oh look, I've got some data here to say this is a good thing. That means we can do away with the old and have this totally new thing. This is basically a very individualistic, liberal idea. You see, with the test of time, it requires a whole community with a whole conscience and a whole cultural set of ideas to determine whether this is a good thing and whether to be continuing this and whether this is helpful. Whereas with this test of reality, it's all on the individual. In this liberal and humanist, in the classical sense of the word, process to determine what they think accords with reality. But without the community, without a culture, without tradition, they have a lot of blind spots that they don't even realize. And two very interesting progressives who are anthropologists and they are very popular podcasters. Haying and Weinstein, they wrote a good book, it's very interesting, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 20th Century. And they basically just took G.K. Chesterton's fence principle and they hashed it out. And they said, okay, we're going to call this the Omega principle and show that cultures and traditions are evolved solutions which could be very helpful to us when facing present-day problems or future problems. An example that they give of an adaptive cultural institution, which they consider to be something that's at least 1,000 years old, is Catholicism, interestingly enough. G.K. Chesterton himself was a Catholic, of course, and it was on the principles of Catholic tradition, the development of tradition, that he based his ideas. And so, point 2 here, abandoning traditional methods could result in unforeseen long-term losses. We shouldn't just replace traditions with a newly discovered option, which is something that they call hyper-novelty. I would call it hyper-individualism. So we must use caution and not abandon the old ways without understanding the consequences first. So as you can see, this is basically just G.K. Chesterton's fence. Now, something that got Haying and Weinstein into hot water and made them less popular with fellow progressives was the fact that they gave the recent lockdowns and novel vaccines in the handling of COVID as an example of something that they thought was hyper-novelty. And so this didn't consider traditional ways of handling a pandemic, which they argue would have been more for the long-term good. Some of the other examples I'm listing on the screen here I've already said. But yeah, it's important to consider, look what's happened to the West when it's abandoned Catholicism with all of these principles and instead, put in its place just naturalism, this individualism, this liberal, I'm just going to find my own way and my own ideas. You do you. How does that serve us? And how does it serve the common good, more importantly? Are things necessarily getting better? So I'm using this term good. What makes a good meme then? Well, there's actually a lot of work on this, interestingly. Good memes can be defined as those ideas which cultivate the mental life beyond individual knowledge acquisition. So it's not just individuals determining, It's not just individuals using the scientific method to determine, oh, I've got some data here, I think that this is a good idea. Well, that's it now. Csikszentmihalyi, who I mentioned before, he spoke of the importance of memes as being not just the DNA of the body politic, but also that which informs the spiritual values. It's something which transcends the body politic, and so it applies to everyone, every member of that body. And this, yes, it helps us to develop new concepts of being and knowing. He puts it like this: spiritual values, spiritual ideas, symbols, beliefs, and instructions for action point to possibilities to which our biological inheritance is not yet sensitive. The sensate deals with what is, the spiritual deals with what could be. So you see, he gives this a futurist aspect as well. It's not just that, not just time-tested values which we must unquestioningly adhere to. This is also opening up our minds to new possibilities. So the spiritual aspect of memes and how they inform the body politic can't be discounted, really. And it was on this basis, really, that Edward Sapir refers to a genuine culture as that which inspires and provides the energy for the pursuit of remoter and more abstract ends. So things basically which satisfy our higher order needs of transcendence, something which is sadly lacking in our modern society. But this raises an important question then. How do we then protect our sacred memes, prevent our culture from losing its religion, and for hyper-novelty and hyper-individualism to innovate away, basically, all of the adaptive aspects of our tradition? Sadly, it's the liberal understanding of what makes a good meme that holds sway in mainstream thought today. In terms of understanding what a good meme is and how we're supposed to protect it, we need look no further than Yuval Noah Harari, who's a professor at the professor of history, a very famous writer at the moment, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he proposes that to anchor us in reality, so that our memes don't deviate too far from reality, this test of reality, and to make sure that we're not developing selfish memes, which could lead to mass extinctions and genocide. He proposes this test of suffering. Does the meme lead to the manifest, observant suffering of a real entity, like an animal or something like that? He says, the best test to know whether an entity is real or fictional is the test of suffering. This is how we can know whether our memes are real things or not. A nation cannot suffer, it cannot feel pain, it cannot feel fear, it has no consciousness. Even if it loses a war, the soldier as an individual suffers, the civilians suffer, but the nation, the body politic, cannot suffer. Similarly, a corporation cannot suffer. The pound sterling, when it loses its value, it doesn't suffer. All these things, they're fictions. If people bear in mind this distinction, it could improve the way we treat one another and the other animals. The cattle. Yes, it's not such a good idea to cause suffering to real entities in the service of fictional stories, he says. Fictional stories. So basically the body politic, the corporate body of people, an organic society, even though the scientific data say that this is a very real entity and it behaves independently, he's saying that our nation, complete with its culture and its memes and all of that, is not a real entity. It's a fictional story. Well, I don't agree with that. The body politic is real. I am a Catholic. And so when St. Paul, on the road to Damascus, after executing Christians, he met with Christ, and our Lord said to him that he was hurting him, that to hurt any member of his body, his church, was to hurt him personally and very really. The body of Christ is no fiction. We suffer with Christ, and he suffers with us. To deny this would be to deny Christ. But if you don't share my beliefs, I still think that scientific data say what they say, and humans intuitively understand this. They intuitively feel good about being a part of a corporate body, a nation, if you will. The reactionary Russian corporatist philosopher, Ivan Ilyin, wrote, "If I think that my motherland is Russia, that means I love in Russian. Contemplate and think in Russian, sing and speak in Russian, but I believe in the spiritual powers of the Russian people and embrace its historic fate with my instinct and will. Its spirit is my spirit, its fate is my fate, its suffering is my sorrow, its flourishing is my joy." This is a man who understands that we are not isolated little islands, that we are born and we are given a language, we are given a culture, we are a part of a much larger process. Indeed, we are a part of a larger organism in many ways. And you cannot really separate out individuals from it. That is the illusion of individualism. So to return to this point of, well, how do we protect then our sacred memes? How do we then stand on this when all the mainstream thought, seems to be very liberal and against this idea of having collective memes and a culture and a nation, etc.? How do we tell our own story? Well, like we said at the start, 80% of people are followers. They're not the innovators. They're not people who move to the new environment and develop a new culture around their ideas and create something which will adapt to this new environment. And they're not necessarily the people who will develop new ideas within the group to help the group advance. It's very important that among our leaders or innovators, or however you want to put it, in that 20%, they have to be people who are spiritually sensitive and care for the spiritual betterment of their people, i.e. the common good. Now we've seen, of course, adaptation, cultural development, these things don't emerge from a vacuum. We're necessarily enculturated. We're born into a culture, and that's something that we're given. Any innovation that exists is actually built on that. Just go and look at modern art. Here you find people who are desperately trying to create an original idea, something totally original. It hasn't come from their background or the country they came from or anything like that, or another piece of art that they've seen. It's something totally, totally original. And all they come up with is something to pervert or reject what they've already seen. They just end up rejecting the culture and the traditions and everything that they came from. Or, perverting it, turning it to some monstrosity. Or they create something so abstract as to be completely useless to anyone, and certainly not something that's going to enhance their spiritual development and lift their thoughts up out of themselves. This desire to reject and to totally separate oneself from the group and from the culture and from the past This is breakaway individualism, hyper-individualism if you want, or as Haying and Weinstein called it, hyper-novelty. And this is a dangerous illusion, to assume that you can have an individual totally separated out from the group. And it's as ridiculous as the idea that a baby just left to itself will somehow develop a language and develop into something, whereas of course we know, sadly, that's not the case. The baby would die. Like a branch falling from a tree, it will wither and it will die because it's not rooted in anything. And this is the satanic rebellion against God. This is Lucifer not being a part of the group and innovating something new within the group, but no, rejecting all of that and saying, I am totally going to do my own thing. And it's an illusion. And it is evil. Very important then that we have control over our memes, and that we police our memes. Because if that 20% that controls the cultural development and the narrative, basically, the political narrative even, of the society, if hyper-individualistic individuals from that 20% control the narrative of the group and continue to propagate very liberal, very individualistic ideas, then the society itself will wither and die. It's like taking that tree and throwing it in a wood chipper and separating it up into tiny pieces. The tree doesn't exist anymore. The tree is dead. So we have to police our memes. How do we do that? How do we police our memes and control the narrative of our own body politic? That's the subject for a future video. To conclude what we've learnt so far in this video, human innovation is a good thing, but it necessarily emerges from a culture comprised of countless ideas and metaphors, memes basically, all of which have stood the test of time. Therefore, a new idea or a new technique should respect, build upon, and seek the good, the spiritual good of the culture. Turn to that imagery of fire as the new technology, the new innovation. If let loose, it would be quickly destructive of many things which took a long time to build. However, contained within the family hearth, it becomes a great source of good, even providing a centre for the ancient family religions, and indeed it becomes an important feature of the culture. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe, and if you wish to support and you want to be a part of this project, I'd be very grateful. Please look out for future videos, and again, feel free to leave comments. Until next time.